All right, in this chapter, we're going to talk about efforts that are made to actually stop murder. So recall that deterrence is based on the idea that punishment should be dissuade a potential offender from committing a crime. If you believe you're certain to be punished and the punishment is severe enough that you wish to avoid it, you should avoid committing that crime. One way we attempt to prevent or deter murder is by instituting strong penalties for people who commit homicide. Also remember that deterrence is made up of both general and specific deterrence. Okay, general deterrence prevents the masses from committing murder. You know a punishment exists, therefore you don't engage in that behavior. Whereas specific deterrence is aimed at a particular offender. You have committed a crime, you have been punished, therefore you won't do it again. Incapacitation is the idea that we want to take somebody, and generally we're referring to incarceration, which in doing some sort of punishment like incarceration that prevents them from continuing to kill. One thing we often focus on is what's called selective incapacitation, and this is for those believed to be very likely to offend because they've offended in the past. Some offenders may be placed in solitary confinement, or certainly the death penalty is the ultimate form of incapacitation. In recent history, incarceration's become even more popular. So in 1997, Marvel and Moody found a 10% increase in the prison population was associated with a nearly 13% fewer homicides. In a 2004 study, researchers found increases in prison population were significantly related to decreases in homicide from 1975 to 1999. It could be that incapacitation works and prisoners rehabilitate, or that those being released from prison are nonviolent offenders. Incarcerating individuals solely to prevent them from committing crimes is troubling in a democratic society because we're not supposed to incarcerate someone without due process of law. So basically, we're not supposed to punish somebody for what they might do. We also have no sound way to predict who will commit murder. Richard Burke has been working with Philly Probation to develop a computer model that uses 30 to 40 variables shown to be related to homicide to generate risk scores for probationers. And some of the data that's been found includes the fact that young, male, serious crimes at an early age and prior record of violence are all risk factors. And so probation boards may be less likely to release those with higher scores in these areas. They may also choose to watch those probationers more closely. However, we're not really good at predicting who is likely to reoffend, and this does raise a problem of false positives and false negatives. A false positive predicts reoffending that would not have occurred, and a false negative predicts no reoffending that does occur. Both of these are costly in terms of freedom and financially. So one thing that's happened is there's been a lot of targeting through what's called lever pulling strategies. And we saw murder rates begin increasing in the 60s through the early 1990s. And so researchers and officials in Boston started working together to try to reduce the number of murders in the city, and they were actually pretty successful. They basically implemented what's called Project Ceasefire, and it was based on the idea that they found a small percentage of the population was responsible for much of the homicide. As few as 1% of the city's youth population was responsible for at least 60% of the homicides involving young people as victims or offenders. This 1% tended to be gang members who had prior arrests. So basically in Project Ceasefire, they implemented a lever pulling strategy that gets tough on crimes. They basically pull every lever, which means they use every strategy that they can employ to prosecute and punish someone who uses a gun in the commission of a crime. So the focus here was deterrence. Ceasefire brought gang members, parolees, and probationers together in town meetings where the new approach to the gun crimes was emphasized to them, and they explained that zero tolerance was being put in place. Convicted offenders and gang members believed to be at risk for homicide victimization or offending were also encouraged to take advantage of social programs. Law enforcement also followed through and prosecuted offenders to the fullest extent of the law. And the big thing that they did in Boston was they prosecuted them federally, which allowed them to have more levers to pull. They cracked down on gangs and publicized it, and adult gang members were sentenced to federal time. Violent gang offending and youth violence decreased dramatically, and then this approach was replicated in both Minneapolis and Indiana. One other thing that happened is we started passing 3 strikes law. These are laws that incapacitate and deter offenders from making a career out of crime. And it mandates a sentencing enhancement for those convicted of a second felony or second offense and a third offense. These laws vary from place to place, and they have failed to demonstrate success. Does not work at all with homicide, in fact. So cities and states with 3 strike laws saw homicide increases as high as 29% greater than those without strike laws. Research tells us, though, that criminals don't think they're going to get caught. Therefore, deterrence doesn't really work. Part of the problem is it's not so much how severe your punishment is or whether you'll get punished, but people have a low rate of actually getting caught. And if you don't think you're going to get caught, then the threat of punishment isn't really going to scare you off. Another thing that happens is offenders are often under the influence at the time and not thinking about the consequences of their actions. 3 strikes, therefore, may have made it more likely for offenders to kill witnesses to avoid identification and arrest. If you know you already have 2 strikes against you and you're committing a 3rd offense, you might be more likely to basically up the ante because you don't really have anything to lose at that point. Capital punishment also fails to deter murder. Those states that do have the death penalty do not have lower homicide rates, and in fact, they actually have higher violent crime rates. So some scholars have wondered, is the issue that there's not enough publicity around the death penalty? So some scholars have looked at the number of murders before and after executions that had been publicized. And initial research showed that when executions were known to the public, they did have a deterrent effect. But more recent research that's more rigorous in its methodology found that publicity does fail to deter murder. Most murders are a crime of passion. If you recall from earlier chapters, we talked about how it's often a situated transaction. Offenders don't stop and think. And over 2/3 of academics and practitioners agree that the death penalty is not a significant deterrent to murder. Gun control is one of the most controversial solutions for reducing homicide. Both proponents and opponents have used scholarly research to support their arguments. We know that we do have great availability of guns in the United States, and that increases serious violence and murder. But guns do not cause violence. Gun ownership by law-abiding citizens may actually deter violence. So these are some of the arguments here. And there's basically no consensus in the field of criminology because most research has mixed findings. And this is because most studies are flawed because they don't have a reliable measurement of gun ownership. So in 2001, Duggan used sales data from Guns and Ammo and was able to show that membership in the NRA and death rates from gun accidents in areas correspond to the sales of guns and ammo. So they basically found a positive relationship between gun ownership and homicide. Duggan further found that the relationship was lagged. Increases in gun ownership, measured as guns and ammo sales, were followed by increases in homicides committed with guns. So increasing gun ownership came before increases in gun homicide. Non-gun homicide is not related to gun ownership. Stolzenberg and D'Alesso in 2000 argued that a weakness in nearly all studies on gun ownership and crime is that it uses the UCR and data on legal gun ownership. They instead used NIBRS data and looked at the number of guns stolen and number of crimes in which an offender used a gun. They found here that legal gun ownership did not affect violent crime and that gun ownership did not appear to have a deterrent effect. They didn't find evidence that overall gun ownership increased violent crime, but they did find that illegal gun ownership was related to violent crime. Youth gun violence was linked to gun theft, and preventing gun theft therefore could prevent homicides. So gun owners should be encouraged to store their guns securely, and law enforcement should institute policies aimed at reducing firearm theft. So some places use what's called gun control and gun buybacks. And looking at this in Australia, in April 28, 1996, Martin Bryant killed 35 and wounded 18 with an AR-15 in Australia, after Australia instituted some of the strictest gun control laws in the world. And what this does is it allows us to compare, sort of do almost a natural experiment. What happened before the gun control laws were enacted versus what happened after. So in 1997, they passed the Australian National Firearms Agreement, which prohibited semi-automatic rifles and shotguns and made legal ownership difficult to obtain and required all gun owners to be registered and licensed. They also instituted a gun buyback program, and they removed over 600,000 firearms. Baker and McPhadren found the buyback reduced gun suicide, but not homicides or accidental shooting deaths. Homicides did decrease after the NFA, but they had already been decreasing. Some also argue that concealed handgun laws may reduce violent crimes, including murder. There's a potential cost to those who perpetrate crimes will increase when more people are armed. Many states do have concealed firearm laws, but they often bar felons from participating. It's very difficult, though, to determine whether concealed weapons laws work to reduce violent crime, and studies show mixed results. They differ based on what factors are considered. So the impact of a law may vary by the jurisdiction. 24 state laws had no effect on homicide or other violent crimes. But the focus here in this study was the enactment of the laws. Homicide rates fell dramatically in the 90s, and this occurred while the economy was growing. Unemployment decreased from 6.8% in 1991 to 4.8% in 2001. Several studies show a link between increases in unemployment and increases in crime. May be less likely that this would impact homicide. In the 1980s, homicides were tied to gang battles for turf and crack cocaine trade. And so this still could be linked through family stressors. If unemployment is low, homicides fueled by family stress may decrease. Fatality reviews attempt to figure out what may have led to a death and what may have prevented it. And these reviews could result in a discovery of patterns contributing to murders that could potentially be staved off if we have new policies and practices in place. And these reviews are commonly used to help social service and criminal justice agencies learn what they can do to prevent intimate partner homicide and child abuse homicide. They also help prevent violence by encouraging interagency cooperation and increasing knowledge of factors related to homicide. Unfortunately, there's no published studies on the impact of these reviews. One thing that's really happened, though, is we have improved medical responses and improved technology. And in 1958, Wolfgang suggested that medical and technological advances might possibly explain decreases in homicide rates from the 30s to the 50s. And this could also explain decreases in the 90s. So think about things like the availability of cell phones and cell phone service, as well as improvements in medical care. So emergency response times have decreased. We have trauma centers and medical facilities that can handle traumas. So it's not necessarily that this reduces homicide, but it may prevent an aggravated assault from turning into a homicide. In 1988, the study found that emergency transportation was linked to lower homicide rates in Florida in the 1980s. Another thing that might help is early intervention programs that focus on teaching elementary or middle school children how to solve conflicts. It's difficult to determine the impact of these programs long term because they often have short evaluation periods, and it's difficult to really follow up with a group of kids, later on into their lives. So one program is the PeaceBuilders Universal School-Based Violence Prevention Program that helps students deal with conflict. And this was evaluated after 1 year and 2 years of the program. And the biggest impacts were on first and second graders who were found to be less aggressive and more pro-social. The Tariq Khamisa Foundation, which was founded by Azim Khamisa, whose 20-year-old son was gunned down by a 14-year-old gang member, emphasizes forgiveness rather than revenge in order to stave off confrontational homicides. It focuses not only on Tariq's murder, but the consequences it had for Tariq and his family, as well as Tony Hicks, who was the offender. Interventions in terms of domestic violence can also decrease murder. Early intervention by social services and the criminal justice system may be key in these cases. So people who interact with victims of domestic violence should be aware of the danger so that domestic violence is taken seriously. Risk factors for domestic violence homicide include the availability of a firearm, marital separation, depression, and the abuser's drug or alcohol abuse. This is difficult to study, though, because it's hard to know if an intervention has prevented something. It's hard to know why something didn't happen. We can also focus on reducing those confrontational homicides we learned about in Chapter 7. Over half of all homicides involving an adult male in England and Wales, either the victim or the offender had consumed alcohol. So the UK has attempted to reduce violence in establishments serving alcohol. So the physical design of pubs and clubs make them more spacious. The furniture is arranged so there's less likelihood that individuals will inadvertently bump into each other. And they can also train staff so that staff are more likely to reduce potential violence than escalate it. Pubs and clubs that had high violence rates were also threatened with removal of their liquor license. And that wraps up the chapter on stopping murder.